The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Riley's Steakhouse as James Porter pulled his blue sedan into an empty spot. The small restaurant stood just off the highway that led into his hometown of Oak Ridge, a place he hadn't called home for nearly 12 years. James sat in his car for a moment, taking a deep breath and adjusting his collar in the rearview mirror. At 45, his face carried the weathered lines of someone who had seen more than his share of life's hardships, but his eyes still held a quiet strength. The drive back to Oak Ridge had been longer than he remembered, or maybe it just felt that way. After 2 tours in Afghanistan and years of moving from city to city, trying to find his place in civilian life, James had finally decided to return to the town where he'd grown up. His aunt had left him her small house on Maple Street when she passed, and after months of consideration, he'd decided it was time to put down roots again. Might as well get something to eat, he muttered to himself, turning off the engine. The thought of cooking in an empty house on his first night back didn't appeal to him. Besides, Riley's had been around since he was a kid, though he'd never actually eaten there. His family couldn't afford it back then. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the entrance. He noticed his slight limp was more pronounced today after the long drive. His right leg had never been the same after the roadside bombing in Kandahar. It wasn't bad enough to require a cane, but on tired days like today, the old injury made itself known. James pushed open the heavy wooden door of the steakhouse and was immediately enveloped by the warm aroma of grilled meat and fresh bread. The restaurant was busier than he'd expected for a Thursday evening. Almost every table was filled with families and couples enjoying their meals. The sound of laughter and conversation created a pleasant buzz throughout the space. The interior was rustic but well-maintained, with wooden beams crossing the ceiling and soft yellow lights giving the place a cozy feel. What caught James's attention, though, was the wall to his right. It was covered in framed military photos, medals, and patches from various units. His eyes automatically searched for anything from his own unit, a habit he'd developed whenever he encountered military memorabilia. "Welcome to Riley's," a cheerful voice greeted him. A young woman with a bright smile stood behind a small podium near the entrance. Her name tag read Beth. "Just one tonight?" she asked. James nodded. "Yes, just me." "Follow me, please," Beth said, grabbing a menu and leading him through the crowded dining room. James felt several pairs of eyes glance his way as he passed. He was used to it by now. His military haircut and posture often gave away his background, and being one of the few black faces in this part of town had always drawn attention, though not always the welcome kind. Beth led him to a small corner table that offered a view of both the restaurant and the large windows facing the street. "Your server will be with you shortly," she said, placing the menu on the table before walking away. James settled into his chair, wincing slightly as he stretched his right leg under the table. The drive had definitely taken a toll on him. He picked up the menu and began scanning the offerings, though he already knew he wanted a steak. It had been his tradition after returning from each deployment, a good American steak to welcome himself home. Today, it seemed fitting to continue the tradition as he returned to his hometown. As he looked over the menu, James found himself distracted by the wall of military photos. From his seat, he could see several frames holding pictures of men and women in uniform, some from as far back as Vietnam, others more recent. There were handwritten notes beside some of them. He made a mental note to take a closer look before leaving. The restaurant had a warmth to it that wasn't just from the temperature. The wooden tables were worn smooth from years of use, and the booths along the walls were filled with families sharing meals and stories. An older couple at a nearby table caught his eye, and the man gave him a friendly nod, which James returned. Perhaps coming back to Oak Ridge wasn't going to be as difficult as he'd feared. James's thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "Good evening, sir. Can I start you off with something to drink?" He looked up to see a waitress standing by his table. She appeared to be in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and a warm, genuine smile. Unlike some of the forced customer service smiles he'd encountered over the years, hers reached her eyes. Her name tag identified her as Diane. "Just water for now, thanks," James replied. "And I think I already know what I want to eat." "Perfect. What can I get for you?" Diane asked, pulling out a small notepad from her apron pocket. "I'll have the ribeye, medium rare with the roasted potatoes," James said. closing the menu and handing it back to her. "Excellent choice," Diane said, jotting down his order. "Our chef has a special way with the ribeye. I think you'll enjoy it." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a curious expression. "Are you just passing through town or visiting someone?" The question caught James off guard. He wasn't used to small talk from servers in bigger cities. "Actually, I'm moving back," he said. "Grew up here, but it's been a long time." "Well then, welcome back," Diane said with that same genuine smile. "Oak Ridge isn't perfect, but it's home for a lot of us. I'll get your order in right away." As she walked away, James noticed her pause to speak with an older man behind the counter who looked to be in his 60s. The man glanced in James's direction, and James felt a familiar tension rise in his shoulders. He'd experienced too many uncomfortable situations not to be wary when people started taking special notice of him. James distracted himself by looking around the restaurant more carefully. The walls were decorated with local sports memorabilia alongside the military photos. There were faded pictures of high school football teams from years past, and even a signed jersey from someone who'd apparently made it to the minor leagues. It was exactly the kind of place that captured the spirit of a small town, preserving its history and celebrating its modest victories. The sound of the door opening drew his attention. A young family walked in, a couple with two small children who couldn't be more than 5 or 6 years old. The kids were excitedly talking about something, their voices carrying across the restaurant. James couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. He'd always liked kids, their honesty and straightforward view of the world. He'd thought about having his own family someday, but life had taken him down a different path. When Diane returned with his water, James noticed her watching him with that same curious expression. "Your food will be out soon," she said, placing the glass on the table. "Is everything okay so far?" "Everything's fine," James assured her, though he couldn't help adding, "Is there something wrong?" Diane looked surprised by the question. "No, not at all. Why do you ask?" James shrugged, trying to keep his voice casual. "Just wondering." "Oh, I'm sorry if I was staring," Diane said, seeming to realize how her attention might have appeared. "It's just—" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind. I'll check on your food." As she walked away again, James took a long drink of his water. The restaurant continued to buzz with activity around him, but he felt strangely isolated at his corner table. Coming back to his hometown was bringing up mixed emotions. There were good memories here, but difficult ones too. Growing up black in a predominantly white town hadn't always been easy, and joining the military had seemed like his best option for building a future at the time. He'd served his country proudly for 14 years before the injury forced him to reconsider his path. The transition to civilian life had been harder than he'd anticipated. The structure and purpose of military service had become such a fundamental part of who he was that finding his place in the regular world felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. James was pulled from his thoughts by the aroma of grilled steak approaching his table. Diane appeared with a steaming plate that she set down carefully in front of him. "One ribeye, medium rare with roasted potatoes," she announced. "Can I get you anything else? Steak sauce, perhaps?" James looked down at the perfectly cooked steak, its juices pooling on the white plate. "No, thank you. This looks perfect," Diane smiled. "Enjoy your meal. I'll check back with you in a bit." As James cut into his steak, he noticed Diane stopping to speak with the older man behind the counter again. They both glanced his way, and this time the man nodded slowly. James felt that familiar uneasiness return, but he tried to focus on his meal instead. The steak was indeed excellent, tender and seasoned perfectly. Whatever else was going on, at least the food was worth the stop. Through his meal, James caught Diane watching him several more times. Once, when their eyes met, she quickly looked away and busied herself with another table. James couldn't figure out what was happening, but years of experience had taught him to stay alert to his surroundings. He ate his meal deliberately, savoring each bite while keeping a subtle awareness of the restaurant around him. As the sun began to set outside, the golden light filtering through the windows gave the restaurant an even warmer glow. Families continued their meals, unaware of the slight tension James felt at his corner table. He finished his steak and potatoes, genuinely impressed with the quality. Whatever else might happen in this homecoming, he had at least found a good place to eat. What he didn't know yet was that this simple dinner was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge his perceptions and perhaps even change the course of his return to Oak Ridge. James cut another piece of his ribeye, savoring the rich flavor as he chewed slowly. The steak was perfectly cooked, pink in the middle with a well-seasoned crust on the outside. Despite the uneasiness he felt about the occasional glances from Diane and the older man, he couldn't deny that Riley's Steakhouse knew what they were doing in the kitchen. As he ate, James found himself thinking about his childhood in Oak Ridge. Growing up here hadn't always been easy. As one of the few black families in town, the Porters had faced their share of challenges. His father had worked at the lumber mill for 30 years, earning respect through sheer determination and work ethic. His mother had taught third grade at the elementary school, beloved by her students but still facing subtle prejudices from some parents. They had raised James and his younger sister to be proud of who they were, but also cautious in a world that didn't always welcome them with open arms. The military had been James's ticket out, chance to see the world beyond the boundaries of their small town. The structure, the clear rules, the opportunity to be judged on performance rather than appearance, all of it had appealed to him. And for 14 years, the Army had been his home and his family. "How's everything tasting?" Diane's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood beside his table with a genuine look of interest on her face. "It's excellent," James replied honestly. "Best steak I've had in a long time." Diane's face lit up with a warm smile. "I'm so glad to hear that. Our chef Roy takes a lot of pride in his cooking. He's been with the restaurant for almost 20 years now." James nodded, taking a sip of his water. He noticed a small silver bracelet on Diane's wrist with what looked like military dog tags attached to it. The sight of it made him curious, but he didn't ask. It wasn't uncommon for people to wear memorial jewelry for loved ones who had served. "Can I get you anything else?" Diane asked. "Maybe some dessert? Our apple pie is homemade." "I'm tempted," James admitted with a small smile, "but I should probably pass. Still have to finish unpacking tonight." "Oh, so you really are moving back," Diane said, seeming genuinely interested. "Where about in town?" James hesitated before answering. Years of keeping personal details close to his chest made him naturally cautious, but there was something open and honest about Diane's manner that put him at ease. "Over on Maple Street," he said. "My aunt left me her house when she passed last year. Took me a while to decide what to do with it, but eventually figured it was time to come home." Diane's eyes widened slightly. "Maple Street? Not the blue house with the big oak tree in the front yard?" James was surprised. "That's the one. Did you know my aunt?" "Mrs. Porter, of course." "Everyone knew her," Diane said with warmth in her voice. "She used to bring us zucchini bread every summer from her garden. Said she always grew too much and couldn't let it go to waste." Diane's expression turned apologetic. "I'm sorry for your loss. She was a wonderful lady." James felt a tightness in his chest at the mention of his aunt. Martha Porter had been his father's sister and had remained in Oak Ridge after James's parents moved to Arizona for his father's health 5 years ago. His aunt had been a constant in his life, sending him care packages during deployments and always keeping him updated on hometown news. "Thank you," he said quietly. "She was special. I'm glad to hear people remember her fondly." Diane hesitated, then asked, "So you're James, her nephew?" He nodded, somewhat surprised that she knew of him. "That's me." A look of recognition crossed Diane's face, followed by something else, a mixture of respect and curiosity. "She talked about you all the time, always showing pictures from when you were overseas." James felt a wave of emotion that he quickly pushed down. His aunt had been so proud of his service, sometimes too proud in his opinion. He'd never felt entirely comfortable with being thanked for his service or treated differently because of it. "That sounds like Aunt Martha," he said with a small smile. Never met a stranger she couldn't turn into a friend in 5 minutes flat. "She was definitely one of a kind," Diane agreed. She glanced over her shoulder at the older man behind the counter, who was watching them with interest. "That's my Uncle Frank," she explained, turning back to James. "He owns this place." "He knew your aunt too." James nodded in acknowledgement toward the man, who raised his hand in a small wave. The tension James had felt earlier began to ease slightly. Maybe the looks hadn't been about what he'd feared. "I should let you finish your meal," Diane said. "But it's really nice to meet you, James. Your aunt spoke so highly of you." As she walked away, James felt a complex mix of emotions. It was strange to be back in Oak Ridge, where the connections between people ran deep and stretched back generations. In the cities where he'd lived after leaving the military, anonymity had been both a comfort and a curse. No one knew his story, but that also meant no one understood his journey. He returned his attention to his meal, cutting another piece of steak as he glanced around the restaurant. The family with the young children was leaving, the kids bouncing with energy while their parents looked pleasantly tired. An elderly couple sat by the window, eating in comfortable silence that spoke of decades together. A group of middle-aged men at a large table laughed loudly at something one of them said, their easy camaraderie reminding James of his unit. The wall of military photos continued to draw his attention. From his seat he could make out some of the frames, soldiers in desert camouflage, Marines in dress blues, old black and white photos from wars long past. It was a common sight in small-town America, this honoring of those who served. But James had always had complicated feelings about such displays. While he appreciated the recognition, he also knew that the reality of military service was far more complex than what could be captured in framed photographs on a restaurant wall. James finished his steak and pushed the plate away, feeling satisfied. The meal had been worth every penny. He reached for his wallet, preparing to ask for the check, when he noticed Diane speaking with her uncle again. This time their conversation seemed more animated, with Diane gesturing slightly in his direction while Frank nodded thoughtfully. When Diane approached his table again, she carried a small dessert plate with a slice of apple pie topped with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. "I know you said you were going to pass on dessert," she said, placing the plate in front of him. "But Uncle Frank insists. On the house." James looked at the pie, then back at Diane with confusion. "That's very kind, but why?" Diane seemed to consider her words carefully before answering. "Let's just say we have a soft spot for military folks here, especially ones connected to Mrs. Porter." Her hand unconsciously touched the dog tag bracelet on her wrist. "My brother served too. Army 10th Mountain Division." The mention of her brother's unit explained the bracelet. James felt a sense of connection, the unspoken understanding that exists between those who have served and their families. "Thank you," he said simply. "And please thank your uncle as well." Diane nodded. "Enjoy the pie. It really is homemade." As she walked away, James looked down at the dessert. The gesture touched him more than he would have expected. It wasn't about the free pie. It was about being seen, not just as a stranger or as a black man in a predominantly white town, but as someone connected to a place and its people. The pie was still warm, the crust flaky and golden. James took a bite and closed his eyes briefly at the taste of cinnamon and apples. His aunt had made apple pie too, though hers had always included a hint of lemon that made it distinctively hers. This one was different but equally delicious. As he ate, James noticed other diners beginning to leave. The dinner rush was winding down, with only a few tables still occupied. The lighting in the restaurant seemed to grow warmer and more intimate as the crowd thinned. Through the windows he could see darkness had fallen completely, the parking lot illuminated by tall lamps that cast pools of yellow light. Frank emerged from behind the counter and made his way to a table nearby, checking in with the customers there. He was a solidly built man with salt and pepper hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent years working hard. There was an easy confidence in the way he moved through the restaurant, greeting people by name and asking about their families. James watched him, trying to place if he recognized the man from his childhood in Oak Ridge. The town was small enough that most people knew each other, at least by sight, but Frank didn't seem familiar. Perhaps he had moved to town after James left. Or maybe he was one of the many adults James had simply never had reason to interact with as a kid. When Frank finished with the other table, he looked over at James and gave a nod. James wondered if the owner would come speak to him, but instead Frank returned to his position behind the counter, occasionally glancing in James's direction. James finished his pie, savoring the last bite of ice cream as it melted into the warm filling. He had to admit it was the perfect end to his meal. As he set his fork down on the empty plate, Diane appeared again, this time with a check in hand. "Was the pie good?" she asked, though his clean plate already answered the question. "It was perfect," James confirmed. "Thank you again." Diane placed the check on the table. "No rush. Take your time." James picked up the small black folder and opened it, expecting to see the cost of his steak dinner. Instead, he found a handwritten note paper clipped to the receipt. His heart began to beat a little faster as he unfolded it. unsure of what to expect. The note was written in neat handwriting on Riley's steakhouse stationery. As James began to read it, he felt the world around him slow down, the ambient noise of the restaurant fading as he focused on the words in front of him. Little did he know that what was written on that small piece of paper would change everything about his homecoming to Oak Ridge. James stared at the note in his hands, but before he could read beyond the first few words, a loud crash from the kitchen pulled his attention away. He quickly folded the paper and slipped it into his shirt pocket as several staff members rushed toward the commotion. Diane hurried past his table with an apologetic glance. "Be right back," she called over her shoulder. James sat back in his chair, his curiosity about the note temporarily overshadowed by the activity in the restaurant. Through the swinging kitchen doors, he could see people gathering around something on the floor. There were concerned voices, but no sounds of pain or panic, which suggested whatever had happened wasn't an emergency. He took a sip of water and glanced around the dining room. Most of the other customers were watching the kitchen doors as well, their meals momentarily forgotten. An older woman at a nearby table caught his eye and shrugged with a small smile, the universal gesture of "these things happen." After a few minutes, the activity in the kitchen settled down. Diane emerged through the doors, brushing her hands on her apron. She stopped to speak with a few tables, apparently explaining the situation and apologizing for the disturbance. When she reached James, she gave him a somewhat tired smile. "Sorry about that. One of our dishwashers knocked over a stack of plates. Nobody's hurt, just a mess to clean up." "No problem," James replied. He gestured to his pocket where the note was safely tucked away. "I was about to read—" "Oh!" Diane's eyes widened slightly. "Actually, if you don't mind waiting a moment on that, Uncle Frank would like to speak with you when you've had a chance to look at it. He's just helping with the cleanup right now." James felt that familiar tension return to his shoulders. What could be so important about this note that the owner wanted to speak with him about it? His instincts, honed by years in the military and navigating uncertain situations, put him slightly on edge. Yet something about Diane's open expression kept him from becoming too concerned. "Sure," he said with a nod. "I can wait." "Great, can I get you a coffee while you wait?" "On the house, of course." "Coffee would be nice, thanks," James replied. As Diane walked away to get his coffee, James resisted the urge to pull out the note again. Whatever it contained, it seemed appropriate to wait until Frank was available. Instead, he turned his attention to the wall of military photos, which was more visible now that the restaurant had emptied somewhat. From his seat, he could make out several of the frames more clearly. There were soldiers from different eras: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Some photos showed groups of service members, arms around each other's shoulders, dusty and tired but smiling. Others were more formal portraits in dress uniforms. Many had small cards or notes beside them with names, units, and dates. James felt the familiar mix of emotions that always came with seeing such displays: pride in the brotherhood and sisterhood of service, sadness for those who didn't come home, and a certain discomfort with the way military service was sometimes simplified or glorified by those who hadn't experienced it. Diane returned with his coffee in a large white mug. "Cream or sugar?" "Just black, thanks," James replied. As she set the mug down, he gestured toward the wall of photos. "That's quite a collection. Has it always been part of the restaurant?" Diane looked over at the wall and nodded. "Uncle Frank started it about 15 years ago after my brother joined the Army. It just kind of grew from there. People from town started bringing in photos of their family members who served. Now it's become something of a tradition." James nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. It was good, strong and fresh. "Your brother," he said, remembering their earlier conversation. "You mentioned he was 10th Mountain Division." Diane's hand went to the dog tag bracelet on her wrist again, a seemingly unconscious gesture. "Yes, he did 2 tours in Afghanistan. Came back different, like most do, I guess." There was something in her tone, a certain weight to her words, that made James wonder about her brother's story. He recognized the way she touched those dog tags, not with the casual gesture of someone wearing them as fashion, but with the reverent touch of someone holding onto a precious memory. "It changes you," James said simply. "The service. The deployments. You come back to a world that looks the same but feels different, or maybe you're the one who's different." Diane looked at him with a depth of understanding that surprised him. "That's exactly what my brother says. that he feels like he's living in two worlds sometimes. Before James could respond, Frank appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He was taller up close, with broad shoulders and hands that showed years of physical work. Despite being in his 60s, he moved with the energy of a much younger man. "Sorry about the wait," Frank said, extending his hand to James. "Frank Riley. This place is named after my father, though it was just a small diner when he ran it." James stood and shook the offered hand. "James Porter. The steak was excellent." Frank smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Glad to hear it. You're Martha Porter's nephew, right? Diane mentioned it." "Yes, sir," James confirmed. "Your aunt was a fine woman. Came in here every Sunday after church for the pot roast special. Always had a kind word for everyone." Frank gestured to the chair across from James. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" "Please," James said, sitting back down. Frank settled into the chair with a small grunt. "So Diane tells me you're moving into Martha's place on Maple." "That's right. Just drove in today, actually." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Welcome back to Oak Ridge, then. Town's changed some since you left, I imagine. Got a new high school building finally, and they're putting in one of those fancy roundabouts on Main Street that no one can figure out how to use." James smiled. Some things about small towns never changed, like how a new traffic pattern could become the talk of the town. But some things stay the same, Frank continued, like how folks here remember their own. He nodded toward James's pocket where the note was tucked away. "Have you had a chance to read that yet?" James shook his head. "Not yet. Well, I won't rush you, but when you do, I hope you'll understand the spirit it's offered in." Frank's cryptic comment made James even more curious about the contents of the note. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded paper. "Do you mind if I—" he asked, holding up the note. "Please," Frank said with a nod. James unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was neat and precise. "To Staff Sergeant James Porter, U.S. Army 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 10th Mountain Division. Your Aunt Martha made sure everyone in town knew about your service and sacrifice. My son Thomas served in the same division in Afghanistan. He didn't make it home. When Diane recognized your division insignia on your keychain, I wanted you to know that in this place your service is honored and remembered. Your meal tonight is on the house, not as charity, but as a small token of gratitude from one military family to another. Welcome home, soldier." The note was signed simply Frank Riley. James felt his throat tighten as he read the words. His eyes moved to his keychain, which he had placed on the table earlier. The small metal insignia of the 10th Mountain Division was there, a sword within a blue rectangle with a red border and white mountain peaks. He carried it out of habit, a small reminder of the years that had shaped him. He looked up at Frank, who was watching him with a quiet intensity. "I'm sorry about your son," James said, his voice low. Frank nodded once, acknowledging both the condolence and the understanding behind it. "Thomas was proud to serve, just like I suspect you were." "I was," James confirmed. "Still am in many ways." He glanced down at the note again. "But you don't need to cover my meal." "That's very generous," but Frank held up a hand, stopping him. "It would mean a lot to me if you'd accept it. Thomas would have been about your age now. When Diane spotted your keychain and then realized you were Martha's nephew, well, it felt like one of those moments where paths cross for a reason." James understood that feeling. In the military, you learn to recognize those moments. Coincidences that didn't feel like coincidences. Connections that seemed somehow meant to happen. "I appreciate it," James said finally. "Thank you." Frank seemed satisfied with this response. "Good, and I hope you'll come back. Veterans get half off on Thursdays, but friends of the Riley family eat at the family rate." "Which is?" James asked. Frank's serious expression broke into a warm smile. "We figure it out as we go. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's just the cost of the ingredients. Depends on how much you help in the kitchen." James found himself smiling in return. There was something refreshingly straightforward about Frank's manner. "I might take you up on that," James said. As they spoke, Diane had been moving around the restaurant, closing out the last few tables as the evening wound down. Now she approached their table again. "Everything okay over here?" she asked, looking between her uncle and James. "Just getting acquainted," Frank replied. He pushed himself up from the chair with another small grunt. "I should get back to work. Closing time soon." As Frank walked away, Diane took his place in the chair across from James. "So, she said, nodding toward the note in his hand. Now you know. About Thomas, James said. I'm sorry. Diane's hand went to her bracelet again. It's been 5 years. Some days it feels like yesterday, others like a lifetime ago. She looked toward the wall of photos. His picture is up there. Third row, second from the right, the one with the mountains in the background. James turned to look at the wall again, focusing on the spot she indicated. From this distance, he could make out a young man in army fatigues, standing against a backdrop of rocky, barren mountains that James recognized all too well. The harsh landscape of Afghanistan had been his home for nearly 2 years of his life. Coast Province? James asked, recognizing the terrain. Diane nodded, a hint of surprise in her expression. Yes, how did you know? I was there too. Different time, same place. James studied the photo, feeling that strange connection that came from knowing you had walked the same ground as another soldier, breathed the same dust, seen the same mountains. Did he write to you about it? All the time, Diane said. He said the mountains there reminded him of pictures he'd seen of the moon. Barren but beautiful in their own way. James nodded. Thomas had captured it perfectly. There had been a stark alien beauty to those mountains, deadly and magnificent all at once. As they sat in silence for a moment, James realized something surprising. For the first time since arriving back in Oak Ridge, he felt like he might actually find a place here. Not just a house to live in, but a place where he belonged. The restaurant had emptied completely now, with only James and the staff remaining. The overhead lights in the dining area had been dimmed, leaving just the warm glow from small lamps on each table. Through the large front windows, James could see the empty parking lot, his blue sedan sitting alone under the yellow glow of a street lamp. It was getting late, and he knew he should head to his aunt's house, his house now, to unpack at least enough for his first night back in Oak Ridge. Yet he found himself reluctant to leave. There was something comforting about sitting here with Diane, talking about her brother Thomas and their shared connection to a faraway place that had changed them both, albeit in very different ways. Would you like to see his photo up close? Diane asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. James nodded. I'd like that. Diane stood and motioned for him to follow. They walked together to the wall of military photos, their footsteps echoing slightly in the nearly empty restaurant. The collection was even more impressive up close. Dozens of photographs of men and women in uniform, spanning generations of service. Diane stopped in front of a photo of a young man with a wide smile and confident eyes. He wore army fatigues and stood against the backdrop of Rocky Mountains, just as James had seen from a distance. The photo was framed in simple dark wood, with a small brass plate underneath that read, Sergeant Thomas Riley, 10th Mountain Division. Trying to say 2014. This was taken about 3 months before. Diane's voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. James studied the photo carefully. Thomas Riley had been young, mid-20s at most, with the lean, fit look of an infantry soldier. There was something familiar about his face, though James was certain they had never met. He has your eyes, James said quietly. Diane smiled sadly. That's what my mom always said too. She reached up and touched the frame gently. Uncle Frank put this wall together after we got the news about Thomas. It started with just his photo, but then other families began bringing in pictures of their own. Now it's like a little memorial for the whole town. James looked at the surrounding photos. There were service members from World War II all the way to the present conflicts, each frame telling a story of someone who had left Oak Ridge to serve their country. Some had returned. Some, like Thomas, had not. It's a good way to remember, James said. He pointed to a photo of an older man in Vietnam-era Army uniform. Is that your father? Diane nodded. Dad served in Vietnam. 25th Infantry Division. He passed away about 10 years ago, cancer, not the war. But he always said his time in the service was what made him who he was. James understood that sentiment all too well. His own service had shaped him in countless ways, both good and difficult. What about you? Diane asked. Your aunt mentioned you were injured overseas. James's hand unconsciously moved to his right leg. IED in Kandahar. Took some shrapnel in my leg inside. I was lucky. The guy next to me didn't make it. He didn't elaborate further, and Diane didn't press. There was an understanding between them, the unspoken recognition that some memories were too heavy to share casually. So what's next for you? Diane asked, changing the subject as they continued to look at the wall of photos. Now that you're back in Oak Ridge? James considered the question. It was something he'd been asking himself for months, ever since he'd decided to accept his aunt's gift of the house and return to his hometown. Not entirely sure, he admitted. I've been working security consulting for the past few years. It's decent money, but a lot of travel. Thought maybe I'd look for something more local. Settle in for a while. Oak Ridge isn't exactly a hotbed for security consultants, Diane said with a small smile. No, it's not, James agreed. But that might be a good thing. I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. Frank appeared from the back office, a set of keys in his hand. We're about to lock up, he said. Diane, you heading out too? In a minute, she replied, just showing James the wall. Frank nodded, his eyes moving to Thomas's photo. For a moment, the older man's expression softened with grief before he seemed to pull himself back to the present. You know, Frank said, looking at James thoughtfully. If you're looking for work that doesn't involve much travel, I might have something to offer. James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden offer. Oh, nothing glamorous, Frank continued. We lost our maintenance manager last month. He moved to Columbus to be closer to his grandkids. Place like this always needs someone handy with tools, good at solving problems. Hours are flexible, pays decent, plus free meals on shift. The offer caught James completely off guard. He'd expected to spend weeks looking for work, gradually reintegrating into the Oak Ridge community. He certainly hadn't expected a job offer his first night back in town. That's very generous, James said carefully. But you hardly know me, Frank shrugged. I know your aunt, and she wouldn't stop singing your praises. I know you served in the same division as my son, and I know when someone has the look of a person who gets things done. He gestured around the restaurant. This place isn't fancy, but it means a lot to this town. I need someone I can trust to help keep it running smoothly. James didn't know what to say. The offer was tempting, a chance to work with his hands, to be part of something meaningful in the community, to put down roots in a way he hadn't in years. You don't have to decide right now, Frank added, seeing James's hesitation. Take some time, get settled, think it over. The offer will still be here next week. I appreciate that, James said. I'll definitely think about it. Frank nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good enough for me. Now I hate to cut this short, but I've got to close up. Diane, you need a ride home? Diane shook her head. My car's out back. I'll just finish up with James and lock the front door on my way out. All right then. Good to meet you, James. Hope we'll be seeing more of you around here. Frank extended his hand again. James shook it firmly. Thank you for everything tonight, sir. The meal, the conversation, all of it. After Frank left, heading to the back of the restaurant, James and Diane stood in the dimly lit dining room. The silence between them was comfortable, like the easy quiet between old friends rather than people who had just met. He doesn't offer jobs to just anyone, Diane said finally. He must really see something in you. James looked back at the wall of photos, his eyes finding Thomas's picture again. Or maybe he sees something of Thomas in me. Same division, similar age. Diane considered this, then shook her head. No, that's not it. Uncle Frank isn't looking for a replacement for Thomas. He's too practical for that kind of thinking. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I think he sees someone who might understand this place, what it means to the town. Someone who might care about it the way he does. James wasn't sure how to respond to that. The idea of being trusted with something so meaningful to this family, to this town, was both appealing and intimidating. I should probably get going, he said finally. Still have to unpack at least enough to sleep tonight. Diane nodded. Of course. Let me walk you out. As they headed toward the front door, James glanced around the restaurant one more time. Hours ago, when he'd first walked in, it had been just a place to get dinner on his first night back in town. Now somehow it felt like something more, a connection to his past and possibly his future. At the door, Diane hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card. Here's my number, she said, handing it to him, in case you have any questions about the job. Or if you just want someone to show you what's changed in Oak Ridge after all these years. James took the card, noticing it was a simple business card for the restaurant with her name and cell number written on the back, in the same neat handwriting as the note. Thanks, he said, tucking it into his pocket. I might take you up on that, Diane smiled. I hope you do. She unlocked the front door and held it open for him. Good night, James. Welcome home. The night air was cool against his face as James stepped outside. He stood for a moment in the parking lot, looking back at the restaurant with its dimmed lights and closed sign now visible in the window. Diane waved once before locking the door behind him. As James walked to his car, he felt the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. The long drive, the unexpected connections, the emotions stirred by memories of his aunt and his time in service. Yet despite the heaviness, there was also a strange sense of lightness, of possibility. He got into his car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. In his pocket was Frank's note and Diane's phone number. In his mind were the images of Thomas's photo and the wall of remembrance. And somewhere, growing quietly but undeniably, was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, coming back to Oak Ridge had been the right decision after all. James started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward Maple Street and the house that was now his. As he drove through the quiet streets of his hometown, he found himself planning to return to Riley's Steakhouse very soon. Not just for the excellent food, but for the unexpected sense of belonging he had found there on his first night. Home. Little did he know that his simple dinner at Riley's had set in motion events that would change not only his own life but the lives of the Riley family as well. What had begun as a meal would become the first chapter in a new story, one of healing, connection, and finding home in unexpected places. 3 months had passed since James's first dinner at Riley's Steakhouse. The late summer heat had given way to the crisp chill of autumn, and the maple trees that gave his street its name were ablaze with red and gold leaves. James stood on a ladder outside the restaurant, carefully replacing the burnt-out bulbs in the sign that illuminated the parking lot. From his vantage point, he could see most of downtown Oak Ridge, the hardware store, the small movie theater, the library with its stone steps worn smooth by generations of visitors. He had accepted Frank's job offer a week after that first night, once he'd settled into his aunt's house and realized that working at Riley's felt right, in a way that few things had since leaving the military. The work wasn't glamorous, fixing leaky sinks, maintaining the aging kitchen equipment, handling electrical issues, but it was satisfying. Each repair, each improvement gave him a sense of purpose and belonging that he'd been missing for too long. "How's it looking up there?" Frank called from below, shielding his eyes against the afternoon sun as he looked up at James. "Almost done," James replied, twisting the last bulb into place. "Should be good for another 6 months or so, but we might want to think about switching to LEDs soon. They last longer and use less power." Frank nodded thoughtfully, put together a proposal on the costs, and we'll see if we can fit it into next quarter's budget. That was one of the things James appreciated about Frank. He listened to suggestions and treated James like a valued member of the team, not just a handyman. Over the past months, their working relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of loss and service. James climbed down the ladder and folded it up. "Anything else you need done before dinner service?" "Nope, I think we're good. Why don't you take off early today? You've been here since 6 this morning." "I don't mind staying," James said, though the idea of a few extra hours to himself was appealing. Frank waved him off. "Go on, enjoy the weather while it lasts. Winter will be here before we know it." James nodded his thanks and headed around to the back of the restaurant where his truck was parked. He'd traded in his sedan a month ago for a used pickup that was more practical for hauling tools and materials. The blue Ford was nothing fancy, but it was reliable and suited his needs perfectly. As he stowed the ladder in the truck bed, the back door of the restaurant opened, and Diane stepped out. She wore jeans and a Riley's Steakhouse sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as always. "Heading out?" she asked, walking over to his truck. "Yeah, your uncle's giving me the rest of the afternoon off." Diane smiled. "Well deserved. I saw the new shelving you put up in the storage room. It's going to make inventory so much easier." "Just doing my job," James said with a small shrug, though her appreciation meant more to him than he let on. Over the past 3 months, he and Diane had developed an easy friendship. She'd made good on her offer to show him what had changed in Oak Ridge, taking him around town and reintroducing him to places and people from his childhood. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine of sharing coffee during her breaks or occasionally watching a movie at the small theater downtown on her days off. "Any plans for your unexpected free time?" she asked, leaning against his truck. Thought I might finish the porch railing at the house. It's almost done, just needs a final coat of paint. Diane nodded. She'd been to his house several times, helping him sort through his aunt's belongings and make the space his own. The white looks good against the blue siding. Thanks to your suggestion, James said. His initial plan had been to paint it blue to match the house, but Diane had convinced him that the contrast would look better. She'd been right, as she often was about such things. Listen, Diane said, a hint of hesitation in her voice. I was wondering if you'd like to come to dinner on Sunday. At my place, not here at the restaurant. James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the invitation. They'd shared many meals together, but always at Riley's or one of the other restaurants in town. Uncle Frank will be there, she added quickly. And my mom. It's kind of a monthly thing we do. Nothing fancy, just family dinner. The word family hung in the air between them. James felt a warmth spread through his chest at the implication that he might be included in such a gathering. I'd like that, he said simply. Diane's smile brightened. Great, 6 o'clock? I'll text you the address. 6 works. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, she replied. Then after a moment's thought. Actually, maybe that apple pie you were talking about, the one your aunt used to make with a hint of lemon? James smiled, touched that she remembered that detail from one of their conversations. I'll see what I can do. No promises on how it'll turn out, though. I've never been much of a baker. I'll risk it, Diane said with a laugh. She glanced at her watch. I should get back inside. We've got that big party coming in at 5, James nodded. See you tomorrow, then. As Diane walked back to the restaurant, James found himself watching her go, appreciating not just her physical presence, but the steady, genuine person she was. Their relationship had evolved gradually, from strangers to colleagues to friends, with the potential for something more always hovering just beyond the horizon. Neither of them had rushed it, both carrying their own histories and hesitations. James got into his truck and started the engine, his mind already turning to the Sunday dinner. The invitation felt significant, a step beyond their casual friendship into something more intentional. The fact that it would include Frank and Diane's mother made it clear this wasn't just a date, but an incorporation into their family circle. As he drove through town toward Maple Street, James reflected on how much had changed in just 3 months. Oak Ridge, which had once held mixed memories of both belonging and exclusion, now felt increasingly like home. People greeted him by name at the grocery store, the bank, the post office. His identity here was no longer solely defined by being one of the few black families in town or by being Martha Porter's nephew, but by his own connections and contributions. At a stoplight, James's phone buzzed with a text message. He waited until he was parked in his driveway to check it. It was from Frank. Forgot to mention, Veterans Group meeting Thursday at 7, Legion Hall. Thought you might be interested. James looked at the message for a long moment. He'd noticed the flyers around town for the Veteran Support Group, but had always found a reason not to go. In the cities where he'd lived after his discharge, he'd attended a few similar meetings but had never quite found the connection he was looking for. Something had always felt missing, perhaps because he'd been missing that sense of home that made healing possible. After a moment's consideration, he typed back, I'll be there.